Thank you for having me. It's great, and it's really good because I've managed to catch up with people who I should be seeing in the UK and finding out what they're up to, which is really good, and things which are triggering for me. So my background was started off as a journalist, and then went working in radio, and then swore I'd never work in television, and then ended up working in television in kids' programs by sort of quirk of circumstance, and was very much a purist. I want to make the programs that I want to make. And then I had this sort of epiphany moment making a kids game show back in '97, which was an interactive game show. And most of the things I'll just talk about in my career have been things where I've come away going, you know what, we missed the really big question, and that's the one we're going to solve next time. And the problem was about a kids' interactive game show was we wanted kids at home to engage and play with the contestants in the studio. And up to that point, the only things that you've seen were voting shows, which are just a very poor experience unless the prize is so massive and going to change someone's life forever. You don't really care about voting. But what I did find was children had a real appetite. They really wanted to participate. And that's when I changed from going, I'm someone who broadcasts stories at you, to being someone who wants to make stories which is a two-way relationship with the audience. So that sort of stuck with me. And then I got very involved with the Red Button, which at the time in the UK was very big. And it was the only way to do interactivity around audiovisual. So audiovisual was my background. And I did some one of the first interactive documentaries around the Walking with Dinosaurs brand. And that, for me, just whittling that year and a half of my life down to, that became about trying to work out how you can personalize a documentary, realizing that actually we all come to stories with our own sort of filters and baggage. What if we could shape it slightly? And the Dinosaurs brand was brilliant because it was trying to be all things to all people. Had been over-anthropomorphizing. They'd done the series already, which was being got criticised for being too anthropomorphized. It had Kenneth Branagh as the narrator, and everyone said they turned it into theatre. So all the hardcore scientists wanted more science. So we made basically switch between different versions of this program, which allowed you to have a scientific narration. We had a picture-in-picture where you saw the science of what you're seeing edited in vision, which was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do, because what you're seeing in vision had to complement the CG animation. But that was about personalization. And as a result of that, I got to set up a Red Button team at the BBC to experiment, and I sort of go through all the things. So I'm going to go through every buzzword I can think of now. I did a choose your own endings, did a number of choose your own ending interactive narratives, and the thing I came away from that is I still think there is something in choose your own endings. It's not the answer for everything, but the big thing for me there was don't push on too many barriers at the same time. What I tended to see was everyone was trying to make really, really intelligent dramas, but they were also pushing what was the expectation on the audience at the same time. And the one which worked for us best was when we did a good old-fashioned whodunit, because everyone knew the vernacular. You didn't have to worry about that. You just knew you had to solve a crime, and the only bit you had to worry about was how you used the remote control to do it. So don't push on too many barriers at the same time. I did a distributed computing experiment. Do you know distributed computing? SETI? Okay. So I was working in the science department at the BBC, and we wanted to do something on climate change. And at this time, I got to the stage a bit like, I think, Christian, the story. You know, I wasn't quite the hobo. I think I wrote down some notes. I was the sort of the new boy on the block who was, it's good if you get us awards, it's good if you make us look as if we're trying to be innovative, and it's good if you keep everyone excited by what you're doing, but don't undermine the existing hierarchy in television, whatever you do. And it eventually got to a stage where I was just banging up against brick wall. We weren't changing anything. So I went back into television as a traditional TV producer. I actually took a I had to go down a grade because I hadn't done, although I'd been executive producing in interactive and running a department, it wasn't considered the same type of executive producing as a TV. So I went back down to be a series producer, but effectively executive produced it. And we did this, we're doing a climate change experiment, traditional linear program, but one of the researchers came up and said, do you know that there's a real problem with climate change modeling, that all the scientists around the world have to rely on a supercomputer in Japan, which had a 2-year waiting list, to be able to do the sort of computations that they want to do. And there were a bunch of scientists, I think at Cambridge University, who'd said what they were looking at was this experiment which had been done, it's been done for around the last 15 years, called SETI, which is the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, which no university was funding, but by asking people to run programs on their own computers in their own sort of idling time, you could do a bit of number crunching. So you got a lot of geeks who were prepared to do this, which is just looking at all the noise coming from outer space and seeing whether there are any patterns in it. They didn't actually have to, they weren't doing anything. The computer program would do it, but it was running on lots of different home computers. And they said if we could do this with 30,000 computers at home, we would match the computational power that we need to do, which is going to take us 2 years before we can do that in Japan. I went, 30,000? We're the BBC, we could do that. And actually, but I was, at that point, the TV science producer, and so going back to the hobo, I got my friends who I'd just been working with on transmedia, cross-media projects, I'll mention it about 5 times, and we sat in the bar and went, how do we get this into the project without telling anyone higher up? And so we went away, we worked it up. I said that this segment started to grow, and we spent a bit more research and a bit more TV money on this segment about these clever people thinking about this bit of science, which we were just filming them. That was honest, we were just filming them. But over the course of 2 months with them, we then came up with a plan about how we could actually take their crude program, make it public-facing. And this was for one of our niche channels, BBC4. And then, as we got closer, we then told the commissioners, and they went, oh, that sounds quite interesting. And we released it a week before the program went out. The program wasn't getting very much marketing. It was another climate change story. You didn't want to hear another one of those. But we had 200,000 people had downloaded this application around the world before we'd gone out without any marketing. So the scientists were absolutely ecstatic because, I can't work that out, that's 7 times they'd have to queue to get to that supercomputer in Japan. So they started, and then it got out through the academia and got into the news, the BBC news, and then the bosses were going, are we doing something about this? This should tie into your program. I said, yes, it's all right, it's in the program. And then we saw, and this is a few examples, this program, which didn't have any marketing, had this huge uplift from what that slot would normally have got by about 50% more viewers. And I can only put that down to that this sort of network were feeding it word of mouth. The network of the 200,000 were all around the world, so they weren't the people watching the show, but somehow just this bubbling noise had sort of seeped into the more people were watching it. So that was, sorry, I'm just getting distracted here. So that was distributed computing. I did a voting participation show called Great Britain's. I think it's been translated into other territories. But what, again, was sort of, the problem was someone had decided we were going to do a voting participation show around documentary series around 10 Great Britains. No one was getting voted off. They were all dead already. And you're going, what's the vote? And actually now, what we did is we took a vote, and you could vote every week, so you keep voting for the same person. It doesn't matter what no one was going to change their mind according to the documentary. But we came up with a model where to earn your right to vote, you had to tell us why you thought, even if you thought Princess Diana was the greatest Briton of all time, to earn your right to vote again this week, you had to tell us why the person we're looking at this week, which is John Lennon, why he's in that top 10 according to various qualities of greatness. And that, now, we call it data visualization, but we were getting data, and we turned it into we had a live 5 minutes at the beginning and end of each show with one of our political commentators who normally does the elections, swingometer going this way and that way. And he was going, and yes, Lennon is now in the top over here because people think he was a great charismatic man, and compared to Diana, who's right down here. And so, all we were doing was creating a story out of the data that people were feeding back to us. It was very crude. We couldn't do any of the clever graphics that you could do now. So, again, voting participation, but actually more thinking about what it means to the viewer and what they get out of it. And then I went back to children. So my story came full circle. And at Children's, I was then asked to look after interactive services across interactive TV, web, and this sort of cross-platform space. And we did a bit of it. We were doing a bit of everything there. So we'd done some mobile. We did some mobile treasure hunt. Learned some big things there that we were obsessed with telling stories using headphones, and then we realized that actually we were taking people out of the environment that they had gone to do the treasure hunt in. You're sort of abstracting them from their environment. And, and there were ways to do it, but you realize what you get wrong at the end of each project. We've lots of digital franchising, gamification, another buzzword, and played around with alternate reality games. And again, I think it was talking about your rules of the 60 or the 560. Absolutely a case of we looked at all of the ARGs and went, this is a law of diminishing returns. There's no, I went to a few conferences where if anyone told you anything about the statistics, you were lucky. And one person told me that they'd done this campaign for a big beer brand, and at the end of the journey, they reckon between 5 and 15 people had actually finished the journey and were likely to buy that beer as a result. And you're going, and how much did this cost you?
Can we just, does people know what an ARG is? Some do. Can you just mark?
Okay, so an alternate reality game is, I suppose, it's a game where the fabric of the game is all around you. So that rather than thinking of it in a computer or somewhere, that our world is the game world, and that you superimpose a story on it, which is what you've created. But I still think there's a lot in the... So we then went and said, how do we do that for kids, knowing full well that we couldn't send children outdoors looking for clues or going onto the web to go to places that they might mistype something and get something wrong. So we created what I've called a faux ARG game, a FARG. And it was just literally, again, taking the vernacular of that world, but it was essentially lots of mini-games, but dressed up to feel like you were... Now you can go out onto the open web. No, you couldn't. You went to a few fake sites that we'd made within an environment. Now you can go out into the streets. No, you can't. You can go and look at a panoramic video where you can look around and see if you can find the people. So it felt like you were going out into the real world, but actually it was a series of mini-games. And we coined this phrase, it has to be exclusively for everyone. Because most ARGs work on rewarding the exclusivity, but rewarding how clever you are to get up to the top of the pile. But I've got a few slides I need to talk to you about what my problems are now. Have I got time?
Yeah, you have 2 minutes.
Okay, no, that's good, that's fine. So where I'm concentrating, I've sort of come back full circle now. Going back to the thing about where's the money, who's got the power, is back on television. And that's how people used to think television was. The reality is can you see that? That's how a lot of people are consuming television. And what I find really interesting is that the device on the right has evolved and we're starting to understand what it's good for. The device at the bottom, well, let's say take a mobile phone, started off just trying to put telly on mobile phones, but now we know what they're good for. They're personal, they're locative. We haven't really reinvented what the television's good for. And I come back similar to Martin's view. My view of the world is that television is a construct that's emerged out of the limitations of industrialization of storytelling. So The best before television used to go to the theatre. Theatre is completely two-way interactive. The actors know how, can feel the sense of the room. You go to comedy, it's all about being in a shared experience. You laugh because there are other people with you. You watch it on television, you don't laugh out loud. It's sort of weird sensitivity. So how do we bring that back to television? And the technologies are now getting there with connected TV, but the real worry for me is it's being driven by the manufacturers who are coming up with things like this. That's just interfaces. That's just the way of chopping up content and giving you different ways of doing it. And no one really is going, but what's the experience? What's special about that box in the corner of the room? And I think there are some things which are special. It's sort of taken the place of the fireplace. It is something that we collect round. It is a social experience, whereas this, looking at this, isn't very social, because you have to look over someone's shoulder to enjoy something at the same time. It is collective in a cultural sense as well. So how do we take all the things that we think are great about the web and mobile from being, and then relay them back onto TV? And I'll just give you the 4 things that I'm working on is how does television, as we know it, evolve to become more personalized when we want personalized television, more social when we want it to be more social, more affecting so that it can have more effect on us and we can have more effect on it. And the one which I think is quite exciting, which sort of is where mobile and the converged living room, going back to that original picture, could go, is how does television, the experience up there, then permeate into the rest of the room while you're watching it to make it more immersive.